Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to part 6 of my second video game generation retrospective, or recap series, whatever you like to call it. Part 1 was on the generation as a whole, Part 2 was on the Atari 2600, Part 3 was on the Magnavox Odyssey 2, Part 4 was on the Mattel Intellivision, Part 5 was on the ColecoVision, and Part 6 is here on the Atari 5200. Now first, before we get into this console, there are other consoles in this generation. I don't have them, at least at the time I make this video, so if I ever get them, I'll kind of retroactively throw them in there. But otherwise, this is the end of this particular series, so let's hopefully you enjoy this last part. Now, the Atari 5200 here is an odd console. Obviously, you already heard in that list there that Atari already had a console in this generation. What happened? Yes, you may not know this if you're not super into the history of video games, but there is precedent for having two consoles in the same generation. And this isn't even the only time that ever happened. Most recently, SNK did that by having the Neo Geo AES and the Neo Geo CD in the same generation. It does happen. It's uncommon, but it does happen. Generations aren't always defined by the technology simply getting better. It's also part of the timing, it's part of the history. Generations are an odd thing to define. But yeah, what happened with this one is it ultimately kind of became this weird sacrificial console that Atari really should never have made. But yeah, and that doesn't mean I don't like it. It just means from a business standpoint, they shouldn't have done it. But here, let's talk about the story behind this thing, then my history with it, and then we'll talk about some of the games here. Now, basically what happened with the Atari 5200 is Atari was killing it with the 2600. They were doing extremely well, and that bred a lot of competition. You know, a lot of these consoles popped up. Obviously, some of the ones I already talked about before. Things like the Intellivision, the ColecoVision, etc. And Atari was noticing a trend that the games that were coming out on those consoles looked a lot better. And the reason they did is because that hardware was a lot better. It was much more advanced. And Atari didn't want to be left in the dust, so they went, all right, we don't want these guys to replace us. You know, we have to come out with something new to show that Atari is still relevant and can still make you know, powerful gaming experiences. So they looked at their computer line, and I believe they took the Atari 400 PC. I'm sorry, I think that's what they took. And they basically consoleized it into this, the Atari 5200, which was a perfectly acceptable piece of tech under the hood. That wasn't the issue. The problem with this thing was just about everything else. When Atari released this in 1982, they basically intended for it to compete with the Intellivision, and it more or less ended up competing with the ColecoVision for a very brief time. They wanted to make certain changes to this based on feedback from the 2600. People didn't really like how overly crowded the 2600 was with buttons and switches, so they would put a lot of those into the controller. They also wanted greater multiplayer capabilities, so initial versions of this console had 4 controller ports. Mine only has 2. This is the later iteration. People also didn't really like that they needed to have a separate video cable and a separate power cable. Not really understanding why that's necessary, they just didn't like it. So Atari, for a very brief time, tried this thing where they had both signals go over the same cable, and it had this like weird little box and stuff. Notoriously unreliable version of the console. Do not get that version. And Atari realized that was a bad idea because when they went to the slightly redesigned version here, they took that out entirely. This has a hardwired video cable on the bottom of it that has this nice little wrapping, like these little prongs here that stick out so you can kind of wrap that around. I really appreciate that. That's one of those like positive things that they did, because the 2600 didn't really have that. And they also stripped out the 2 extra controller ports. I guess they realized those were more expensive than were necessary, and they didn't feel they needed to be there, so they could reduce costs on the console. They also had this bizarre door on this thing, which is why it's so big. It really didn't need to be here, but the whole point of it was just so it could house the controller. Like, that's it. That's the only reason it's there. I would have told them you don't need that. Well, I would have told them you don't need this whole console in general, but then hindsight's 20/20. Yeah, so the idea was that it would be able to compete with all those consoles on that level. But ultimately, all it did was alienate people. People looked at it like, oh, it's this. You have to understand that at the time, people didn't know that you were going to have to upgrade your consoles. That wasn't a concept. It wasn't anything anyone understood. You know, we accept that now, but back then when they first saw that, they're like, I have an Atari. What are you talking about? What is this one? What does that do? Why do I need that? People believed when you were buying it, you were buying a game console that you would just have for 40 years or whatever, like until it died. Kind of like when you would go in and buy a refrigerator. You don't buy a new refrigerator every couple of years. You do it like until it dies. And that's kind of how people looked at it. So Atari had to more or less explain that to people, and they had to be the sacrificial lamb that did so. But yeah, they basically made a ton of bad impressions with this thing from the get-go, all the factors I mentioned before. And on top of that, the most logical thing, the best move they had going for them was their name. They should have been able to bring their fan base with them, but they made a mistake in that they didn't allow 2600 compatibility into this thing. Where, very ironically, their #1 competitor, the ColecoVision, had an adapter that allowed it to play 2600 games. Wrap your mind around that shit. And at least with the ColecoVision, it was common. Atari did ultimately release a 2600 adapter for this thing, but it's incredibly uncommon. It was very late in the game. I've never even seen one. I certainly don't own one. And on top of that, I believe it also required that you use this controller, which we get into that. The biggest of all the issues here is this controller. Now, set aside what you might think of it cosmetically, like it might look ridiculous and all that. It actually, one of the features about it that is actually quite nice is the keypad. I know everybody thinks it looks stupid, why does that need that many buttons, etc. The keypad was not a bad idea. And let me explain it. Basically what would happen is you would get a game and it would come with like a little paper overlay. And you would put the overlay in here, and then the overlay would have special functions with that game. So let's say you're playing like some sort of shoot 'em up or something like that, right? You could press like 1 and it would change the type of weapon you're using, or 2 and it would change how many lives you had, or 3 and it would change your ship. You know, those are just examples, but basically that was the idea. It would just allow you to change stuff on the fly. You have to remember that at the time there were no options menus in games. You couldn't just do stuff that way. And this was better than having to go up to the console and like flip that switch like a bunch of times like you did on the 2600. This was supposed to be much more efficient. Not a bad idea in concept. Problem is the practice. People lose those little paper things. In fact, I have all these games here. I don't think a single one of them has the paper overlay attached to it. Because there's a little slot on the back of the cartridges that allow you to put it there. I think most people just lose them. And on top, but that's not even the big problem with the controller. The problem is the reliability of it. Atari did a horrible job engineering these things. The joypad thing, the joystick, whatever you want to call it, is notorious for breaking, just completely breaking, not working at all. Mine works, thankfully, but it had a second issue, which is completely unforgivable from an engineering standpoint. Inside this controller, and you can see this because I did a video on it a while back, there is like a plastic little board inside, right? And it has contact points. It's, the rubber like buttons here will touch the contact point. The contact point, goes through here and feeds into the console, and that's how you detect what the controller detects what you're doing, right? The problem is, I don't know exactly how they did this because I'm not an engineer, but maybe it was something with their chemical mixtures or something like that, I'm not really sure. But for whatever reason, the ports on there oxidize, and when they oxidize, it can't make a connection. When it can't make a connection, it stops working. And they oxidize extraordinarily quickly. I mean extraordinarily quickly, like 2 weeks. Once they're built, 2 weeks, and they're oxidized. It can be fixed, it can be cleaned. Again, I showed people how to do that in the video. The problem is, it will just re-oxidize within 2 weeks. So like I got this one fully functional a while ago. I'm sure it doesn't work currently. Through no fault of my own, it just sits there and oxidizes. So in order to play it, you have to open it up, clean the shit out of it, put it back together, and then start playing it. And you'll get a couple days out of it basically before you have to do it again. And that was a huge flaw with this thing, because right out of the gate, when people bought these things, controllers didn't work. And your average customer is absolutely not going to deal with that. They are not going to go open those things and clean them regularly. That's not going to be a thing. That was a massive fuck up on Atari's part. And it's amazing that the console was around for a couple of years and they never bothered to fix it. But it is what it is. The other problem, of course, is they use different controller ports. They use not the DIM9 controller ports like Sega Genesis style ports they used on the 2600 and on the 7800. They use these other ones that are much, I think it's the same type of port that's like on the Neo Geo AES and the Neo Geo CD, although they aren't mapped the same, they're different, but it's the same basic port. Because of that, you couldn't use any of the older controllers on this thing. And it wasn't around long enough that anybody bothered making third-party controllers or anything like that. So the only other controller that exists is the trackball controller. Ugh. There are certain kind of adapters for this thing that do allow you to use certain other controllers. So for all those reasons, that's largely why I say really Atari would have been better off never making this thing, because only a year later the game crash happened in 1983, a year after this thing launched, and I'm sure the 5200 largely contributed to it, because the game crash happened for a multitude of reasons, but one was confusion in the market and just too many choices and too many bad choices, etc. Too many customers getting burned, etc. And this did not help matters. If Atari had never made this thing, I'm not going to say the game crash wouldn't have happened, but I will say they probably would have survived it a lot better. The 2600 survived it and weathered the storm and got through. If Atari hadn't made this, it's probable, in my opinion, that the 7800, or what will eventually become the 7800, maybe with a different name, would have probably been much more successful, because people wouldn't have felt burned by Atari. Atari was the steadfast one, the reliable one that had always been there for you. It probably would have been a different story, but you know, who knows. So that, in short, is the story with the Atari 5200. Those flaws aside, again, I don't dislike this console. I actually think it's a cool piece of tech. I'm always drawn to a lot of these consoles that are, you know, kind of considered to be failures. I just think they're interesting. Their stories are what interest me the most. But the game library on it is actually pretty good. Atari did deliver on that. They basically promised more arcade perfect versions of a lot of their games, big upgrades of a lot of their famous games, and you got that. The problem is you can't actually play them because the controllers never work. But before we go into the games, I'll tell you my story with this thing. Not a particularly long one. When I was a kid, I didn't know Atari had ever made a second console, much less a third or anything. You know, I knew they had the 2600 because that's what I had, and I knew they had the Jaguar because I had remembered advertising for it. But the 5200 and 7800 I really had never heard about. Now eventually I was able to find a 7800, and 7800s are more interesting because they're more reliable, they're better game consoles, etc. But 5200 I couldn't find anywhere, because this thing only sold about 1 million units worldwide. It didn't do that well, and so you just never see them. And anytime I did, it was always in like very special retro game stores that knew exactly what it was. They knew how uncommon it was, and they also had to put a hell of a lot of work into it to get it to work, even temporarily, because a lot of those places, if you were going to buy the console from them, they would have to either give you an entire warning about the controller, or they'd have to let you know sit there and clean it in front of you and prove that it works, just so that you could take it knowing full well it works, because they don't want to deal with the return. How much of a warning they'll tell you about when it's going to stop working, I don't know, that's up to them, I guess. But point is, I never wanted to buy it from one of those type of places just because it was always really expensive, and I knew it wasn't going to work for very long. I said, all right, I'll just wait. And my time came. Eventually, I found this one in a thrift store in Wisconsin, like not like a typical like thrift store. This is what's called like a dig and save. The concept isn't that everything in the store is just cheap and you just bring it up to the counter. Nothing in this store is labeled. There's no prices on anything. The way it works is everything is weighted. It's by the pound. So when I saw it, I was digging through a bunch of electronics, and all of a sudden there's just a giant fucking 5200. I was like, holy shit, I have to have this. So I just grabbed it, didn't think about it. Looked around for controllers, looked around for a power cable, looked around for games. I found absolutely nothing else, just the console. And of course the video cable, which is hardwired to it. And I took it up, I brought it to the register, and they weighed it, and it ended up costing me $7. I was like, fuck, I'll take that. $7 for a 5200, never gonna get a better deal than that, never. So then I had to start the task of trying to find a power supply for it. Now unfortunately, Atari didn't make this easy, because they had that first version of the console that used a specific type of power supply. I knew I didn't need that one. But then at the same time, even with this second model, they slightly changed up the power supplies from time to time. Like, it'll fit, but some of them will work, some of them won't. So I had to find the exact one that would work with this particular model, which was not easy. But I did ultimately find it at a retro game store that I know here in Chicago, and it cost me $10. It cost me more than the console, but whatever. So I remember getting it, and then I think I bought like one game, like the cheapest one I could find, just so I would have something to test with it. I believe at that time I then made a video on it, cleaning it and showing it to you guys. And I think I maintained in that video, like, it's great, it works, but I don't have a controller, so I can't actually do anything with it. I think that game was River Raid, I think. But yeah, so for a while there, I basically had the console and it did work, but it didn't have a controller, and I wasn't in any real hurry to get one because I knew even if I got one, I probably couldn't use it. Eventually, if you saw my Intellivision video, you'll know that I was invited by this one game store in Chicago right after they had opened, and they hooked me up with a Mattel Intellivision 2. While I was there, I believe I asked them about a 5200 controller, and much to my surprise, they had one. They had one that was fully functional, and I was like, sweet, done, deal, I bought it. And I brought it back here. I think I paid $15 for the controller, so it was like $15 for the controller, $10 for the power supply, and only like $7 for the console. I think I'm operating off of a few-year-old memory here, but yeah, I remember I got it back and I made a video on cleaning this thing because it was only quasi-functional once I got it back here. Like the joystick part worked, but none of the buttons did, which I knew why, and I wasn't upset with them. It's not their fault. That shit just happens with that particular controller. So I cleaned it all up and I got it working, and I actually spent a little bit of time there playing the 5200. It was nice because I'll probably never do that again because of just the amount of work that it takes. Now that said, I then, once I had a controller that worked, I did decide to run out and get some games. And fortunately with the 5200, the games are worthless because very few people buy 5200 stuff. As far as I know, there is no active scene for the 5200, like retro or like indie scene or anything like that, just because of the lack of ability to play it. So nobody collects this stuff, game stores can't get rid of it, so it just sits there collecting dust. So if you do find it, most of the time the games are absolute bargain bin, sometimes free. A lot of these I got for free in those freebie bins that just show up in some stores. So let me show you the games I've got here. This is literally all of them that I have. Jungle Hunt, Mario Bros. This is the only one that I paid any decent amount of money for, which was only a few bucks, but that's just because of the name, because it happens to be the Mario Brothers franchise. Again, this is the same game that appeared on the 2600 and the 7800. There was an NES version. It's not Super Mario Brothers. It's the game before that, where there's just like pipes and turtles, and you just pop up and try to knock them over and stuff. That's this game, the arcade version, basically. Miss Pac-Man. Pac-Man, a much better version of Pac-Man than the 2600 got. Oh, hey, this one actually does have the overlay. How neat is that? You can see what the overlays look like. They would come out just like this, and then you would stick them into the controller just like that. And it would have different functions. In this case, the only functions that it had was 1-player, 2-player, and game level. So I'm just noticing that now. Isn't that cool? We all discover this stuff together. Now moving on, we have River Raid. This is the one I believe I showed in the video when I was cleaning this thing. And Super Breakout. I loved Breakout, but I don't even know how this would be playable because that one required like a special paddle controller. I guess in theory that would work, but who knows. Now, as a surprise, before filming this video, I decided to run out and see if I could find any more games. I found one store that had a bunch of 5200 games, all worthless. So I picked up, all these are brand new. I've never shown you guys these before because I just got them. Dig Dug, Galaxian, Kangaroo, Popeye, Space Dungeon, Space Invaders, which I kind of actually really want to hook this up and see what this one plays like because I loved Space Invaders on the 2600, and Vanguard. But yeah, that's my entire 2600 collection, or 5200 collection in addition to the console. Yeah, man, that is it. That is really, I really have nothing else to say on the 5200. I would say only pick one of these up if you're a super fan of collecting stuff, because you're not really going to be able to actually use it unless you really, really know how to take care of this stuff and you're really, really patient. But yeah, that's it. Thank you guys for watching this series. Thank you guys for watching all of these series in general. At some point, I'll probably do at least like one video on the first generation, and maybe I'll tackle the handheld stuff at some point. But for now, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you all later.